Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I said good morning. Yeah, thank you. For those of you who don't know me or don't recognize me this year, since I've grown something on my face, my name is Christopher Ludwig. I'm the editor of Automotive Logistics, including the Finnish Vehicle Logistics magazine and our website. Working also with Louis and Nimish on our conferences. Very glad, very happy to be back in Delhi and back in India with all of you. We've got a great session ahead. Very privileged to have with us the President Managing Director of Ford India. But before I introduce our panel, perhaps just worth reflecting a little bit on some of what we heard in the first session. Obviously, we know that it's not been an easy time in India the past year or several years now, with several years of declining growth or declines. Good news seems to be that the expectation, at least, is for some of that hope and promise that we've been discussing in the theme, that some of that will start to be realized. The expectation for 10% growth or thereabouts the next year or two would indeed be very welcome, I'm sure, to all of you. But obviously, I'm not sure that we're there just yet, and maybe not too many people in the room would feel as though we've entered into a strong growth period yet. But there is positive signs ahead. Obviously, we know very well about the logistics challenges that we face, be they in infrastructure, bureaucracy, taxes, port issues, etc. These are top of the agenda, and at least we've heard, even right up to last night, Prime Minister Modi approving some draft bill to hopefully start to push us in the right direction. So things are perhaps not as fast as we want, but things are happening, and I think, we'll keep our eye on that very closely. As I mentioned in this session, we're going to talk a little bit more about how maybe we can realize some of this potential hope and promise. The theme of the session is Make in India, which of course refers to the government's own sort of marketing policy and industrial strategy. And one thing that of course we feel very strongly at Automotive Logistics is that a strong supply chain and a strong logistics processes are really essential to creating an efficient manufacturing and export base. We do conferences and we cover this industry globally, whether it's China, Brazil, Russia, Europe. And the one thing, we can often point to where there are strong processes, strong systems put in place. These are often the most advanced manufacturers, where they treat logistics not just as a waste, but as perhaps something to invest in as well, whether it's efficient, improved inventory management systems, just as one example, which help forecasting of vehicles and dealers and to help build the supply chain in a smarter way. And I think certainly another way to measure how let's say valuable a company treats its logistics is when your boss can understand it, right? And the boss understands its inputs and understands its complexity. And I think that's why it's great that we have Nigel Harris here today to address the logistics audience from a senior level. Of course, Nigel took over his role, I believe it was earlier this year, 29 years with Ford, starting out in New Zealand and moving through various parts of a true citizen of the automotive industry now, right? Whether it's Europe, Asia, China, most recently, I believe, as head of sales and distribution in Asia Pacific. So I would think has a very good understanding of what logistics means to a business, what it means to the top line and to the bottom line, and certainly in terms of what's happened in China, for example, over the past decade, and be interesting to have some comparisons to what he sees and is experiencing now in India. We're also very pleased to have Vinny Mehta, who's the Director General of the Automotive Component Manufacturers Association of India, who can talk from a supply-based point of view and talk about some of the figures on that side and what logistics indeed can mean for tier suppliers. Also interesting, I was chatting with Vinny before. He's been with the association for 4.5 years now, but had a career before that, more on the IT manufacturing side. So interesting again to get maybe some perspectives beyond automotive logistics and beyond just even the automotive industry. One more thing to note, so we'll have our presentations and our Q&A when I expect lively participation from you. And at the end of this session, or towards the end, we're going to do some voting survey. Where we'll present you some questions, some from our sponsors, some from us, and you'll vote on the answers. The way we'll do that, you'll access this voting via the live system that we've been discussing. We'll bring this up again at the time, but if you want, you can start perhaps logging into it in advance. There's the instructions in front of you there. You need your email address and your delegate number. For just a reminder, that is the number on your badge. So you have that right on you. And then that'll allow you to participate in the voting together with, we anticipate, our global audience from other regions who will be voting as well. So that's all from my side for now. And now I'd like to introduce Nigel Harris. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for being here, and it's, I guess, my privilege to get the chance to talk to you a little bit about this from an OEM's perspective in terms of what's going on in the Indian industry at present. I smiled at the theme for the conference, Hope and Promise, and thinking about the logistics environment that we're in, I was sort of hoping it's more about delivery at this stage. In actual fact, I think it is about delivery because as you look at certainly what we've done as Ford Motor Company, we've invested a substantial amount into the Indian industry with our facilities in Chennai and our soon-to-be launched facilities in Sanand and Gujarat. We're actually dealing, certainly, we believe, with a lot more than hope or promise. We believe we're actually getting to the point now where it literally is at delivery. So why would we think that? A couple of things that I think support it. First off, you know, the recent launch of Make in India, I thought was a very strong statement from the government and a very clear intent in terms of what the government intends to do with the industry here in India. And they talked about facilitating investment and, you know, building best-in-class manufacturing facilities. Having had experience in Tamil Nadu and in Gujarat, we have a lot of confidence in that response, and certainly in that theme of what the government is doing or where the government is taking us. And you know, I can think of a couple of examples. You know, I've been in a number of different panels to feed back to the government about the ease of doing business in India. And in those panels, you know, the difficulties that a lot of companies face are in real estate procurement, in utilities and infrastructure in terms of road and rail. And in both of those states, and in particular Gujarat, all of those were made very available to Ford Motor Company after discussions with the government to make sure we had the land, the utilities, you know, the power and the water, uninterrupted supply, and then roading as well. In actual fact, as we talk about vehicle logistics or finished vehicles logistics out of Sanand, we've also been talking to the government about building a rail siding up beside the plant to support both the Tata and the Ford factory there for getting our exports into the port and overseas. So I think when you consider the relationship between the current government and Gujarat and the understanding of what works, that's really positive. In terms of the importance of the automotive industry, I think everybody understands it's 7% of our GDP. Here's a number I don't know if any of you have heard before. Directly and indirectly, it employs 19 million people, the automotive industry. And we actually went through this at a CAM meeting just recently, and I was surprised at the number. But the numbers extrapolated over, you know, the direct jobs of the OEMs, the suppliers, logistics, obviously, right down through into distribution channels, even right down to the driver. But a huge amount of people are employed by the automotive industry, and that's really important because, you know, when we go back to Amit's presentation this morning, I think he showed, you know, some growth, and I think he showed where we're going to be as an Indian industry in 5 or 6 years' time. And we all believe that India is going to be the #3 industry globally. And when you had a look at the other 5 of that top 6, they were all industrialized countries who all used the automotive industry to actually help grow their manufacturing capability, and importantly, grow their middle class. And so, we firmly believe that by the time we get to 2020, the industry will be between 6 and 7 million units per annum, and that will place India at number 3. That actually fits pretty nicely with us because, our founding father, Henry Ford I, he came up with the $5 a day. I think it was in the mid-20s. He understood the importance of manufacturing probably more than anyone at the time. But by introducing the $5 a day, not only did he improve the importance of manufacturing, but also of creating the middle class. And that's really important as we look at the future. Ahmed actually took us through some numbers before. We've got a very low density of drivers per 1,000 in that driving age, one of the lowest in the world. There is a lot of suppressed demand today. People just waiting for the right opportunity to buy, waiting for the right macroeconomic conditions to improve, whatever they might be. There's a huge amount of interest in buying cars. At the moment, customers just aren't buying the cars. So it's there, and it's just waiting to be unleashed. So, as we look also at the demographics and we look at the GDP per capita through the different regions of India, you can also see that more and more customers are reaching that level of being able to buy a vehicle. We work on a GDP per capita of $5,000 US. That seems to be the takeoff point. It certainly was the takeoff point in China, and it's pretty much replicated here as well, which is an interesting fact. I guess where the promise came from in terms of today's discussion point is, I think 10 years ago a number of reports were published around the promise of manufacturing and export and what it can do for the Indian economy and what the potential was, and I don't think that's been realised yet. But I do still sincerely believe that the current government we've got in place today really understands it, understands what to do, and we're going to see that promise fulfilled or that promise delivered. I'm just coming on to the global manufacturing hub. Our stated goal now is we're going to be a small car centre of excellence for India and the globe. We're going to concentrate on small cars here in India, and we're going to lead the way for Ford Motor Company in terms of small cars globally. So we're going to export up to 50% of our production to around 50 different markets around the world. And that's important, but a couple of things that we need to do to get there. And this is an ecosystem that we need to develop. So our imports of auto components are growing, and they grew last year by 3.6%. They're currently at $12.8 billion. Automotive component imports is $12.8 billion, of which about $2.5 billion is coming from China. So that's a big opportunity for us, and I'm glad that Vinny's here because we're going to talk about this shortly, but that's a huge opportunity in terms of Make in India, and then importantly, driving that scale that Julian talked about earlier on. Couple of examples. One is the electronics side of our business. We still import largely all electronics that get fitted into our vehicles, which really doesn't make a lot of sense. Also, when we're tooling up factories, or if we're tooling up particular models, still a number of the heavy tools are coming from outside India, and that's a real opportunity for India. They're coming from China. They've now got a very strong tooling industry, Korea and Japan. So there's an opportunity in that space. At the recent launch of Make in India, the Prime Minister made a play on words, and we were talking about foreign direct investment, but he said there's another word here, or another 3 words that I'd rather concentrate on. He said, first, develop India. And I think that's where the push is, and that's where the opportunity is, certainly from a supply basis. We talked about scale, or Julian talked about scale earlier on today. Really, really important for us. That's why we're making this a global view. when you talk in 100s or 200,000s, it's actually not enough scale to actually drive any efficiency or any lower cost. So being global in that respect is really important. But you can't rely solely on your export business to do that. You've got to have a very strong domestic industry to launch yourself off that. And all of these successful countries that have actually been strong exporters, South Korea, Japan, Germany, the US to an extent, not China because they're still taking up all of their capacity largely internally, but all of them have done it off a strong domestic base. Even Thailand, for that example, with the 1-ton pickup. So the important thing is we've got to make sure we don't get so caught up in export that we lose the fact that India's really got to be one of the prime points of focus, if not the prime point of focus. A couple of things which will help, and this is very obvious. Interest rates, at the moment are a barrier for investment and a barrier for local investment, so that certainly will help. Tax transparency has been an issue, and we believe the government understands that very clearly now, and are working on that. The next couple are related primarily to suppliers and supply, and that is this whole idea of a quality mindset and maturity of the supply base. I was really encouraged. I was lucky enough to be invited to the ACMA conference a few months back, and I was really pleased to see a number of Indian companies now actually going offshore and setting up with OEMs to provide automotive components overseas. That to me is a sign of maturity and a sign that the Indian component industry is improving. The other point which is important as it relates to suppliers, we talk a lot about localization, and we talk a lot about tier 1 localization. So have we got components being manufactured in India at a rupee cost? And a lot of us quote the tier 1 numbers, and a lot of us have very high percentages of tier 1 suppliers, 70, 80, 90%. But the trick in this one is actually understanding the tier 2 and the tier 3, and understanding just how much is manufactured in India still, as opposed to being imported. And I think there's going to be a stronger sense of requirement or pressure on the tier 2 and tier 3s, mainly from the tier 1 suppliers, to localize more. That's when we actually start to get true Indian cost. In terms of some of our challenges from a logistics perspective, I smiled when Chris said, that it's always good when a country leader can understand logistics. And I looked at Amlin and he was smiling because I think he gives me the very simple version. In fact, I know he does. But I know a couple of things. Our logistic costs in India, as a comparison to China, are about 30% more expensive. It's a study that was done 18 months or so ago. And Julian touched on this earlier before. You can talk about roads built and tonnage shipped and those sort of things, but efficiency and timing, speed to market, speed to port, the reduction of waste around yard stock, all contribute to that 30% cost that we're currently wearing. A couple of other statistics. Today in India, our rail transportation, which is still at I would call a fledgling stage, is about 3 to 5% of the domestic logistic load, if you like, for India. Whereas if you look at North America, it's 50%. That's how they move their cars around the country. We talked about the congestion on roads, the congestion around ports. I think that's obvious. Another thing which is interesting, we don't use the coastline that we've got. We've got 7,000 kilometres of coastline, and we're just not using that as a logistics opportunity. And I know there's been a lot of talk about that as well. When we talk about roads, one stat is 20% of the Indian roads are of good quality. When we were first looking at our our investment here into India, and we're trying to understand how large the industry would go. And one of the questions that came up was, if we have 7,000 new vehicles put on the road every year, are there enough roads to handle it? And I can tell you there's not enough road between here and the cyber hub, which is 1 kilometre down the road. But it's a really valid question, so we actually pulled some stats up. India's actually got the 3rd largest length of road in the world behind the US and China. And that raised a lot of eyebrows. So 3.8 million kilometres, 2.4 million kilometres is paved. Now of that 2.4, I don't know what the qualification of good would be. I suspect somewhat less than that 2.4 that we see. China's got 4.1 million kilometres and 3.4 million paved, and the US is 6.5 million kilometres and all of it's paved. So clearly a big opportunity there, and would be a great help to all of us, not just for our customers, but certainly from a logistics perspective, if we could get that sorted out. We certainly support multimodal logistics. The discussions we've had with the 2 state governments that we deal with, also with the central government, that's also really well understood as well. Be interesting to see what evolves. I'm not sure we got a clear view on that earlier on this morning from our secretary, but that's a key driver for us. So, looking forward from an infrastructure perspective, Julian talked about the efficiency. It's interesting, I just bought a new car in Detroit. I actually bought a Mustang. I sent it to New Zealand. It took exactly 28 days to go from Detroit to LA to get on a ship and down to Auckland. I was actually pretty impressed. And I'm not sure that we're that efficient here in India yet in terms of moving product around. Amlan told me we can move a vehicle from Chennai to Kolkata in 6 days. That's actually not too bad. In China, to get a vehicle from Chongqing to Harbin, which is right up in the north of China, that's 14 days. So, I was trying to do some quick comparisons. It's actually not too bad, but could it be improved? Probably yes. So efficiency is important. Turnaround times in terms of getting vehicles to ports, getting them loaded onto ships and getting them offshore, really important. That port pressure is a real issue for us today, not just on vehicles being exported, but also the reference to what was mentioned earlier on in terms of components coming in and containers being cleared by customs officers, overworked customs officers. We need to be cost competitive. We can't afford to be 30% more than China, and somehow we've got to work through that as an industry, and with the government and between OEMs and yourselves and our suppliers, figure out how we get that a little bit better. Reliability, predictability, environmentally stable, those are all important elements we've got to cover as well. So, how do we get there? This is where I'm certainly not an expert, but I also smiled when I heard Julian talking about the last couple of decades, how India's evolved. I used to come here in the late 90s when we first came into India and first introduced the Icon. And I remember flying into the Chennai airport at the time, and it wasn't the most pleasant experience that I've had in terms of arriving at an airport in those days. I look at it now, and as I travel around the country, I see phenomenal progress in 15 years with the airports that have been put in place. I took a train to Agra in 1999 because I was told not to drive, it would take too long. Now you can get in a car and drive down there in 3.5 hours. So from a one-person perspective, you can see the change that's occurred. But we need to double that and treble it going forward. And using the public-private partnership model seems to be a pretty good model that could be exploited going forward. So that's from an OEM's perspective in terms of what's going on. I think we have seen real change. We are very positive and optimistic. Clearly it's more than just hope. We think India does have a plan. We certainly have a plan. And how it gets achieved is really up to us. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nigel, for a very interesting presentation. Lots of good stuff to pick up on there. Obviously, aiming to export 50% of production here, the need to build up scale in the supply base, particularly at the tier 2, tier 3 level. Clearly, logistics has an important role to play in all of these aspects. And I mean, I think the fact that India logistics costs for Ford 30% higher when compared to China, it kind of speaks for itself in terms of competitive factors, and I'm sure that's something that Ford's going to be working on very, very carefully, and we'll need all of your help. So stuff that we can certainly return to in the Q&A, but I would now like to invite Vinny Mehta, Director General of the Automotive Component Manufacturers Association of India. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. A very good morning to all of you. Let me pick up a few threads from where Nigel left. And there's a lot of mention about increased import for China. I'll share something on that. But let me report something very interesting to all of you. We just did a study in ACMA to sort of quantify an opportunity whether we could export from India into China. And I'm very happy to tell you that in the short run, the Indian auto component industry can export something like anywhere between 7.5 to about 20-odd billion. That's the quantum of opportunity. And next week, along with the 20-odd companies, I'm traveling to China. We are doing technology show inside 5 OEMs. And of them, one of the OEMs has committed to invest in India. They were with us yesterday. So things are happening at a very, very rapid pace. And today I'm going to talk to you about the overview of the industry, a few challenges, and let's see how we could work together. I'm not going to talk too much about ACMA. We are a 20-year-old, we are a 60-year-old industry body, and we represent around 700-odd members, and we do much and more what an industry body is supposed to be doing. And coming to what's happening today in the environment, there's a lot of positivity, yet yes, a lot more can happen, but I think there's a breath of fresh air. And from the overall macroeconomic perspective that Nigel did touch about, I think what's very important, we believe, being a young nation, there would be consumption, and that would also drive the automotive consumption. There's a lot of suburbanization happening, a lot of people moving from the rural area into the urban area. That's also going to drive consumption, and we believe it is the young people who would sort of, and their consumption would drive the vehicle industry and in turn the component industry. There is a lot of focus on infrastructure investment today. These are figures pulled out from the current 5-year plan, and I'm sure a lot of you know about these figures, and we in the industry believe a lot more can happen, but nevertheless things have started to move, and that's very, very positive. I would touch upon a little bit upon the automotive industry per se. I believe you've heard them today morning, but nevertheless our demand is derived from the vehicle industry, and therefore let me share a little bit on the vehicle industry. These are the major vehicle hubs in the country. North, west, south, east sort of lags behind because of historical reasons. There's just one odd vehicle manufacturer. But if you look at the chart, anybody and everybody, all global OEMs are present in India today, and we're also very proud of the fact that we have our homegrown OEMs. Very few countries in the world can boast of that. This is a chart that gives the vehicle industry, especially the car industry, by the origin of the country. So we are hugely Japanese dominated. And of course, we have now a sizable presence of the Koreans, almost a quarter of the industry, followed by our local industry, which is 9%, and then the US and the European. And the chart running parallel with timeline gives us the historic decade-wise figures or the names of companies that came into India. And what's very interesting is that if you look at it, all those people who came into India, not one of them have left us, and they continue to survive and thrive. What we're very proud of the fact is that we are the world's largest tractor manufacturer. We're the second largest two-wheeler manufacturer, the second largest bus manufacturer. So if you look at these numbers, within top 10, every single sector of the vehicle industry is present. So we're very happy about this. Production, for the last 3 odd years, the production sort of has remained stagnant around 3 million units. It hovers around there. This is for passenger vehicles. And this chart was, the projection for 2020-21 was done some 2 years back when the industry still looked sort of healthy. It still is healthy, sort of the macroeconomic indicators are very strong at that point in time. And at that point in time, we believed by 2020 the number would be something like 9 to 10 odd million a year. But well, the way things are, we believe this would shift by another 2 odd years, but the numbers remain. So you could do something like 9 to 10 odd million by, say, 2023, that kind of a time frame. And sort of this is for the rest of the vehicle industry, and you see all of them have been doing sort of steadily okay. Commercial vehicle industry sort of has been a little bit of a concern because it is a bellwether of the economy, and when the economy doesn't do well, the commercial vehicle industry has been suffering. Coming to the component sector, I think we are very proud of the fact that if in the manufacturing industry, if one sector that continues to do well, that is the component industry. And the figures in the brackets are figures in US dollars, and these figures in black are in Indian rupees. So we are something like 2,11,000 crores of industry, which is like 35 billion US dollar. Considering the vehicle industry has been performing poorly, especially the commercial vehicle, the component industry had a degrowth of 2%. However, our cumulative growth remains strong, which is something like 14%. And this year, we think we'll be positive in early digits. In terms of our product profile, we manufacture almost everything under the bonnet. So engine parts constitute around a third. Another 20% comes from transmission drives, and the rest of the segments of the industry contribute almost equally, somewhere around 10%. And of course, sort of we're very proud of the fact that we are driven by frugal engineering, and we produce high quality, low cost components. In terms of market share coming from the vehicle segments, 40% comes from passenger vehicles, another close to 20% comes from commercial vehicles, another 20% comes from two-wheelers, and the rest, it's the tractors and the three-wheelers, which are around 5%. What's very interesting is that despite the domestic market performing poorly, the exports did rather well. They grew something around 5.5 odd percentage, and we exported around $10.2 billion. And what's again important to note is that US is our single biggest market. Almost more than a fifth of our exports go to the US. And if you look at the continents, Europe accounts for almost close to 40% of our exports. So the point I'm trying to make is that our quality and our engineering skills is well respected over the globe, and our products are being accepted rather well. And what aids our exports is that almost close to 35 IPOs, international procurement offices, are now present in India, be they for the OEMs or be they for the tier ones, and these are who's who in the world. So they help us in identifying components and sourcing and eventually supplying to wherever in the globe that our components are required, so they're shipped out from here. Our imports, we are, if you look at the trade balance, it's net import from a components perspective. While we exported around 10.2 billion, our import bill was around 12.8 billion. And since there's been a degrowth in overall industry performance, the import also fell by about 6%. What's very interesting to note here is if you look at the chart, the countries that we import from, we have OEMs present in India from Germany, from Japan, from South Korea. Thailand happens to be an important Japanese manufacturing base. So it's logical that there be import from these countries. But interestingly, we do not have a single OEM from China, and we import the maximum, almost 21% from China. And that's of concern to us, essentially because Nigel did refer to this. Essentially, a lot of the imports from China are for the aftermarket, and unfortunately in India, in aftermarket, we do not have mandatory standards. We are working with the government. Hopefully in next maybe 2 or 3 odd years, we will have a solution or a resolution to this issue, but an unregulated aftermarket is a concern for us, definitely. And Europe also, and Europe is a big trade partner again here. Almost more than a third of our imports are from Europe. Essentially, these imports would be for those vehicles where the level of localization isn't much. So that's why, and these are all high technology imports, whereas imports from Asia, especially China, are mostly low-end aftermarket imports. Yeah, policy environment, what drives the automotive industry, the auto policy of 2002 and the automotive mission plan 2016 is the basic framework from which most of the policies are derived, and we are reworking on the automotive mission plan to have automotive mission plan until 2026, and hopefully that will again lead to still better policies that will drive the industry. I'm not getting into these details on policies, but essentially we are a completely de-licensed industry. You permitted 100% foreign direct investment and repatriation of profit. We are compliant to the UN EC WP29, and we work closely with all our counterparts globally on making standards, emission norms, and stuff like that. And of course, the industry has been sort of robust. Quality in the industry is taken for granted, and I guess everybody 5S, 7W, Kaizen, TQM, TPM, Six Sigma, lean manufacturing, as I said, is taken as a given. But what's very important to note, because the culture in the industry has been very Japanese dominated, because Japanese OEMs, especially Suzuki and Honda Motors, were the first one to come into India about 2.5 decades ago, and as a result of which the culture in the industry is very Japanese. And today we have something like 14 odd Deming Awards in the component sector, which is the highest number of Deming Awards outside of Japan. So we're very happy about this. There's an emergent culture on R&D and innovation, and essentially the component industry, which is what's called as a build-to-print industry, would like to graduate to making its own products, designs. Essentially, this is a sign of maturity in the industry, wherein you would like the OEM to come to you and say, hey, look, I need a solution, rather than giving you a design. And that's our ambition. The Indian industry per se is not there, but sort of a whole lot of the OEMs, some of the larger global tier ones, have set up their engineering centers in India. We believe in some time they'll be spawning off, and that would also lead to a culture of R&D. And I've sort of highlighted some of the automotive companies who are doing a lot of R&D in India, essentially to make a point that there is an emergent ecosystem, though a lot needs to be done about it. On the challenges that the industry faces, I'm sure those of you who live here are well aware of various challenges that we have, but I think capital is one of the most expensive in the country, and it's sort of a problem. I do not know how do we address it, because the interest rates are high, and currently capacity utilization is also a challenge, because the industry is working on something like 60 to 70% on your capacity utilization. Lot can be done on the infrastructure. It's happening, but it's way too slow. Hopefully, I do not know that the government will sort of revitalize things. There's a lot of hope. Inflation is, as of now, under control. Availability of skilled manpower is a challenge. We are 1.2 billion people, but getting the right people is tough. Managerial depth is also an issue, because sort of a lot of the times on the management front, first of all, we do not attract the best of the talent. They go to the IT industry, then to the OEMs, then to the component sector. And that apart, the vehicle manufacturer would sort of invest in newer plants in different geographies. They would want you to set up plants in their backyard. You want people, you want managers, and managers are not unwilling to move to remote locations. So that's again a challenge for us, and I'm sure it's as much of a challenge for the vehicle manufacturers. I talked about the R&D competence. A lot needs to be done here, and of course, integration of the supply chain is a huge challenge, especially when we look at the tier 2s and the tier 3s. These are probably the weakest link in the value chain. I would like to admit that the tier 1s have not done a great job in terms of hand-holding their tier 2s and tier 3s like the OEMs have done. But again, I think we are an evolving industry, and I think we do realize this, and there are some early movers. They're making an effort. Let's see how things take shape, but then without addressing tier 2, tier 3s, you cannot honestly move up. What happened? Lots been talked about this, a lot of hope. All I wanted to say is that I'm very fond of this logo because it is made up of components. Looking at what our aspirations are, we just did a huge strategic study with McKinsey, and what we've charted out for ourselves is that by 2020, we would like to be an industry that's somewhere around 100 and 150 odd $billion. We would like our exports turnover to scale up from current 10 odd billion to 3x, 35 to 40 billion. We've identified certain geographies where we need to play on. Of course, we've identified some models I would like to share with you, maybe mail it to you, it's too detailed. But we need to do a lot more in terms of having an enabling ecosystem if we really need to flourish. These are all de-risking strategies that we've identified. You could play on the value chain, you could be into manufacturing, or in a design space. These are all individual specific strategies. They could be various geographies that you could play on. You could be an India-centric, you could be exporting, you could have a manufacturing base outside of India. You could move into adjacencies, aerospace, defense, railways, power. Within the automobile sector, you could identify various segments of the industry where you want to play and de-risk yourself. You could look at key customers. You can be OEM-centric, you be aftermarket-centric, you would be either something like a service-centric industry. These are really ways to de-risk and create different footprints if you wish to survive the turbulent environment. So in closing, how we see ourselves graduating is that we need to identify granular pockets of growth, leverage mergers and acquisitions to leapfrog competition, build R&D capabilities, and sort of own IPs for a better bargaining position. Diversify and build capabilities to serve adjacencies. A lot focus. We're doing a lot here in defense and in aerospace. Work with government, which we do all the time to improve competitiveness. Hopefully it would listen. And of course, addressing the supply chain challenges is key on our agenda. We're working towards it, and I hope things should show some result. Yeah. So that's about it. I know I was a little rushed. This presentation can be done in 2 hours. So there I am, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, thank you, Vinny. Well, you know, to use logistics terms, you were just in time. I think the clock had just turned over on 20 minutes there, so very well done on that timing. But also, of course, another very interesting presentation. I think some of the numbers alone just really interesting. If not the ambition to grow exports, for example, from 10 billion to 30 to 40 billion in a short space of time. And some of the competitive issues that India faces to get there. So although, you know, again, we're talking about Make in India, and that I think we have connected to hope and promise still in lots of ways, because both the speakers did point to some very ambitious goals. And now we would like to open up the floor to questions. So we have a question right away, straight up front. If we can, thank you. Say your name and company.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark Morgan. I'm from the Unicar Group, which is part of Bureau Veritas. We specialize in inspection, testing, and certification, and we are one of the sponsors here. My question really to both the panel members, and taking into account the points you just made about the high levels of quality, certification, and so on, there is what is the importance of quality within both components and finished vehicles when you compare it to cost and efficiency, which we've heard so many times this morning, are big issues and key issues to the growth, the future growth of the Indian market. So where does quality come within that? Is it a high priority, or again, behind cost and efficiency?
Maybe I'll go first. I mean, it really depends on your market and your customer, and you know, what meeting those expectations are. So as you look at the Indian market, I'm not talking about Ford at the moment, I'm just talking about general OEMs. There is a different level that's actually required or demanded from the customer, different to maybe what you'd see in Europe. Really good example is you know, in India, a hard instrument panel, you know, a hard feel instrument panel is perfectly acceptable, considerably cheaper. So it's more craftsmanship than quality, I might add. Versus European, which is very definitely soft feel. That's what the European customer looks for. So there's those sort of differences. But in saying that, from my perspective, and again from an Indian customer's perspective, quality is really important, that it, you know, the vehicle delivers what the customer expects, and what the customer expects in India is actually very high. There are, you know, I have discussions with customers on a pretty regular basis around what their car should still be doing 12 years after they bought it, and that's just fine. I mean, they are demanding, so quality has to be good. And you know, do you deliver that behind cost or what have you? No, you can't. Yet you can't afford to do that, especially in this market as well, because this market's I think it's hard to get trust, and trust with your end consumer, and I don't know what the background of that is, or why that would be the case. So I'm not talking about trust for Ford or trust even for automotives, but trust of anyone, trust of a corporate, trust of a government. You know, there's some trust issues, and so quality is a key part of that. So quality is very, very high priority.
I sort of agree on that, and I think the industry has come a long way from a component perspective that I speak, is that we deliver to the specs of the OEMs, and the industry is graduating, sort of we deliver what is expected of us, and there's a lot of hand-holding that comes by from the OEMs. So there are concerns for sure, but then they get addressed, and at the end of the day, it is the vehicle that's delivered to the customer, and sort of eventually you get to read it in the newspapers of what blew up where.
Yeah, not Ford's obviously, but
I sort of didn't say it about it. It wasn't personal.
Can I just add one more comment? This is, I think, a really good case in point. We did a tear-down study of a component the other day, which was a headliner for one of our products, EcoSport. And our headliner has 5 separate layers and 3 different processes to get to that point where it's moulded. And it's about, I can't remember the exact thickness, but it's 5 to 6 millimeters. It's at least 2 millimeters thicker than our competition, and 2 layers extra, right? Now, the benefit is when you're sitting in the vehicle, you get lower NVH. But for the majority of our competitors, and we think for their customers, they don't demand that. So there is a cost difference there. So that's just one example of an expectation difference.
And sort of just to give another perspective is that of what we export. As I sort of made it a point, US is the largest customer. Europe as a continent is the largest in that sense. When you look at the continent, almost 38% goes to Europe. So they would not accept if the quality was not as what they wanted. And again, in terms of what we export, 80% goes to OEMs and tier ones, and then the rest, 20% goes to the aftermarket. So I don't think so there should be a concern on quality. When it comes to delivering, we do deliver.
Okay, thank you. And I think we heard in the first session too, the Indian customer is becoming more sophisticated, and the demands are only going up for his or her expectations, both of a vehicle quality, and we can probably add delivery quality to those metrics as well. Do we have any other questions from the floor right now? And as Louis mentioned in the first session to my team, if I can't see, please do grab one. I have one for Nigel. I think it wasn't a secret that earlier the year there were some supply issues around EcoSport and some waiting periods. I was just wondering if you have been able to address those issues now, and perhaps what you kind of see in terms of capacity, perhaps also with the launch of the new plant coming up, and how confident you are in the capacity for that.
Sure. So just a bit of background there. At one stage we were running order banks of around 6 or 7 months for the EcoSport, which is actually too long because customers just don't want to wait that long. It's a lot better now. One of the things that took us by surprise, and this is what happens when you enter into a market with what is a new segment or a segment breaker, which is what EcoSport is, a mini SUV or mini utility vehicle. What took us by surprise was just the absolute depth of demand for utility vehicles, and maybe it shouldn't have. Going back and looking at a number of different reports and research that we have, more than a quarter, almost a third of all Indian car buyers today actually would aspire to drive an SUV of some sort. They can't all afford to buy one. But up to a third. So that kind of took us by surprise, and we had to manage that. At the same time, we'd made commitments, and this is one of the benefits and one of the pitfalls of being an exporter. We'd made commitments to export to those other markets certain volumes which we had to meet as well. So we met our Indian commitment, we met our export commitment, and it was actually a pretty tough time for a while. We worked with obviously our suppliers, and understanding the capacity that we've got in the Chennai plant. We're now building at a rate that actually meets demand, and so you might have to wait a little while for certain derivatives, but pretty much at the moment we're actually filling demand without doing anything unnecessary or unusual in terms of incentives. Okay.
Great. And maybe just as a follow-on with the Sanand plant coming up, do you foresee any, from a supply capacity point of view, do you foresee any issues there?
No, not really. I think with Sanand, it's a little bit different. We're entering into a segment that's well understood. The competitors are well understood. The size of the segment, the size of the industry, I think we understand as well. And so our expectation, I think we've got our forecasting right. That's always the famous last words. But it's more of a known quantity. The one issue that we have, and everyone has this as well, when over 60% of all new car buyers are first-time buyers, they actually want the latest vehicle. And then there's a special group of people that have to be the first, right? So that initial demand for the first 2, 3, 4 months is always going to be higher than what we can provide. But I think that's a pretty normal phenomenon, but really strong here. It's also really strong in China. And they also have something like 70% of the industry as first-time buyers. So people like to go for latest and the greatest, and that drives it. But I think we'll be in good shape for Sanand. Thank you very much for asking. Do you want to buy one?
Maybe when I move to India, yeah.
Okay.
Vinny, from a supplier perspective, do you see or foresee particular capacity constraints? I mean, especially when you're talking about potential export growth, or let's say aiming for such aggressive export growth, could you foresee any constraints within the Indian supplier base?
In terms of capacity, as of now, we're doing something like 60 to 70%. So there is some surplus capacity that needs to be utilized. But that apart, we're telling the industry to prepare for the next cycle of growth. When in the year 2008, 9, or 9, 10, after the Lehman crisis, the vehicle industry came back. The vehicle industry in India came back rather swiftly. You know, just about 3 odd months, and zoom, you were back on track, and everybody was caught unaware. So we'll be telling the industry that, look, you guys now need to prepare for the next cycle of growth, which sort of is imminent. I think so. First of all, there's excess capacity, and we're telling the people to prepare. So I do not think there should be a challenge. But again, the vehicle manufacturers need to give us honest roadmap.
Good luck getting anything honest out of them, right? Any questions from the audience? You've all gone a little quiet ahead of lunch. I have more though, so don't worry about that. What, perhaps starting with you, Nigel, I mean, from the first session, we heard a bit about some draft regulation and bill coming up. I mean, what would you like to see from the government to help, you know, companies like Ford move ahead now from a Make in India, from a improving manufacturing, logistics, supply chain? I mean, anything from what you picked up in the first session, or that what wasn't addressed there?
I mean, it was the first session was pretty much around I think it was the Motor Vehicle Act, and a fair bit of emphasis around safety, and that's really important. So I don't think there's anyone in the auto industry or the component industry that wouldn't think that safety's a critical piece of it. And building safe motor vehicles is really important as well. But having, you know, a safe infrastructure, good quality roads. You know, we talked about driver fatigue. We talked about age of vehicles on roads. There's a lot to it, and as long as I think the government is fair and equal in terms of addressing all of those things, I think that'll be fine. In terms of specific things for the auto industry, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone just how strong the Chinese industry is at the moment. And I think the Chinese have understood very clearly that, you know, a strong auto industry is good for the economy, it's good for employment, and, you know, for the reasons we talked about before. So I think, you know, that the government needs to keep a very close watch on the auto industry, because it does drive jobs. I think it's almost half of the manufacturing output of India at the moment, which is substantial. And it's a good way to grow the economy. So, you know, if you have a look at what the Chinese have done on a pretty regular basis, they've had ongoing incentives in the industry, and that's kept the industry growing. And they've had arguably good macroeconomic indicators or environment as well, which certainly helps. But, you know, the things that the government are doing around, you know, the discussion on interest rates, it sounds like they're pulling together a very strong budget for February. I think the talk about the infrastructure and now, you know, funding it and getting it underway is going to be critical. All of that given, including introduction of GST, I think on top of all of that, if they create the right environment for the customer to buy, I think we'll be to make sure that the auto industry grows on a double-digit basis, and that'll be good for the economy. And how they do that, there's all sorts of suggestions. As a CM group and as a member of CM, we've actually supported or proposed a scrappage program. Has the double benefit of taking older vehicles off the road that maybe aren't that good environmentally anymore, maybe not safe enough, quite frankly, but also stimulates the new vehicle industry. And you know, government revenue should be okay off that. You know, through the increase and the growth, you know, the taxation or the revenue going back into the government should still be strong. So so we've made a couple of representations around that. Those are the sort of things we think we need to do.
Okay. Did you add anything to that, Vinny?
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. I mean, the entire industry would want to be perceived to be safe. We have one of the highest road deaths in the world, 1,500,000. So it's interest of all that we have stronger safety norms. And yes, we're all waiting for GST, very, very crucial reform. I think I read in the newspapers today it'll be rolled in 2016. And that will make us what is called as pan-India would be one market. And that's critical because from state to state, you don't want to suffer different taxes, cascading impact thereof, and sort of price of the goods vary, and sort of that impacts the market adversely. And I guess some of these reforms are very, very critical.
You can imagine when we were thinking of the theme of the conference and we used words like hope and promise, GST was certainly one of the things probably did a whole conference around that and what hasn't been delivered and hoped and promised for quite a long time. But like you say, hopefully now there's some yeah, I see you. There's progress. So question in the back. Oh no, I think the question is behind you. Sorry.
Good morning, everyone. I am Weber from Daimler India Commercial Vehicle. My question is to both of you. In last session, Amit told that life cycle of a product is reducing from 5.6% to 3.2%. And in fact, you also touched that whenever you are launching a new product, there is a high waiting period for a customer. A lot of pressure is coming from the marketing team to deliver the parts as soon as possible. We have our own constraints like production constraint, part availability constraint. And when we are launching any new product, a lot of import parts are available, means we are going into the product. So this put a huge pressure into a logistics, entire supply chain logistics. And it increases your logistics cost also as a component into the complete vehicle. So how you look into this and how, what is your opinion into that?
So I guess I'll go first if you like. Okay, so just a couple of comments there. I mean, I'm not sure that the age of the showroom will ever get that low in terms of India, and the same applies for China as well. There's a group of really budget-conscious customers out there today. You know, they're buying what I'd call a sub-B product, a very small, affordable product, and we call those legacy platforms. You know, some of those platforms have been in the market 20 or 30 years or longer. Now, you know, over time, as safety standards increase, it's going to be harder and harder to have those legacy platforms stay there, but they still fill or fulfill a role in the industry in that they provide affordable transport for the people who need affordable transport, because not everyone can afford to buy the latest and the greatest all the time. So I think, personal opinion, I think you'll see legacy platforms in the Indian industry for some time, as you see in China today, right? So that's still happening today, even with the growth that they've got. I think on the second point, you know, as we develop new products, and this is something we're working very, very hard on, is the reusability of parts, especially parts that you localize. So, while you might have different outer panels, what lies beneath the panels, you can use the same, time and time again if you design it into your products. HVAC systems, one example. Braking systems are another. So I think, for us, now I'm talking about on behalf of Ford, that's a key, for reusability. So instead of going to a supplier and saying, give us 150,000 pieces or 200,000 pieces of this part for 6 years, and then that supplier having to write off the cost over 6 years, you're going and saying, we're going to put that on 3 models, it'll be 350,000 pieces a year for 12 years because we're going to reuse it for the next cycle as well. Becomes a whole different proposition. Actually helps everybody, I think, including your cost.
I mean, if I understood you correctly, it's a challenge of proper planning. I mean, how do you do things?
Did that answer your question? Yeah.
So I think we had another question here, yeah, with the microphone.
Kishore Sonika from Visteon. This is to Mr. Neil Harris from Ford. Last 6 months back, I planned to buy 2 vehicles. So first I decided, so for my wife, it was Ford EcoSports. So we went there, he said, wait for 9 months. I was working with Visteon, we were very much connected with Ford. So I was knowing what the production was happening in Ford, but I came to know that maximum numbers were going out of India than coming in India. So that vehicle has been lost by Ford, I feel. She was not ready to wait for 9 months. Somebody has, some other customer has won. Same with me. After next month, I bought again, went for a Ford car, and the Fiesta. The situation was different now. The Fiesta I have seen from last 6 years, Fiesta, old Fiesta, new Fiesta, classic Fiesta, Fiesta. And this time which Fiesta came, it was very good looking and perfectly different. But I was not liking the name again Fiesta. So if I tell someone, oh, Purana, old Fiesta you bought. So there is a difference. When we are changing this many times of types of vehicle and everything is upgraded, why can't we think that some name has to be changed? Though it is Fiesta platform, the name has to be changed. Because I feel Indian customers, they feel every time new. Every time after 4 years, I want a new car. So, but name is changed, that will affect. And it may increase the production, I feel that.
Okay.
What you think?
What was your name again?
Kishore Sonekar from Visteon.
Kishore, did you say?
Kishore Sonekar.
So I'm going to rename the car Kishore. Thanks, Kishore. On the EcoSport, hey, you're right. Our capacity, our planned capacity for India is 120,000 EcoSports, and of that planned capacity, 50,000 was the commitment that the Indian team made to that volume, 3.5 years ago when the program was first signed off. The difference was what the export market signed up for. So that's really regrettable, and I really hate hearing stories about that, because that's a lost opportunity for a customer in India, which I really don't like. It was a gained opportunity, I guess, for a customer in another market overseas, but I understand your comment. I understand your frustration. That's the risk of a brand new vehicle on a brand new segment that's not yet developed. The branding one on Fiesta, that's interesting. That's an age-old discussion. I know this has got nothing to do with logistics, but I think it's worth talking about. So Mustang has been out there for 50 years, and people understand what a Mustang is, right? Even in India, people understand really clearly what a Mustang is, because the name stays with it and it represents certain things. Same with F-Series, same with Ranger, same with Explorer, and a number of other brands of Ford and other brands of competitors as well. So the key thing there is people know what they're getting. So if you look at the Endeavour, that's got some really strong brand values that we still have today, even though that vehicle's been in the market for close to 10 years. And so when we bring in a new Endeavour, people will understand that's what it is. It's genuine 4x4, it's off-road, it's masculine, it's rugged. And you don't have to go and recreate a whole new brand for it again. And that's why we do it. That's why we hold on to the brands per se. The complexity you're talking about is the Fiesta Classic and then the new Fiesta from Europe. And that maybe, I understand, we probably need to do some work on that. But a brand value, the values stay with the brand all the way through. And at each iteration of a new product going in to a brand, it should actually add something to that brand and improve it. And that's certainly the plan. That's certainly what we all attempt to do, I think, as an industry.
Okay, thanks for that. Obviously, sometimes it's interesting just to get some other perspectives, go off of logistics. Perhaps we can therefore avoid a Ford Siesta or something like that during this session. But I think some interesting points raised there. I do think we're going to probably move on to the voting. I'll just end one last question to our panel, which is, since we're coming at the end of the year, maybe they can just tell us their wish for 2015 for their company, and then we can move into the voting.
So this is the wish, that I make a little prayer every night, and that is that we realise the potential of what we can do in India. We've talked about, we all know about the demographic dividend and all of the positive things there. I think with the right environment, India could be a real industrial powerhouse, but a powerhouse across all different elements, socio-economic elements. So, what I really hope for is a really good, strong budget in February that fills people with confidence that we're heading in the right direction, and gets people spending again. Because people have got the money, they just don't want to spend. They're waiting to see some evidence. So that's my Christmas wish. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like to see the vehicle industry, especially the commercial vehicle industry, getting back on track, and maybe the overall industry growth should be 15% plus. I mean, that's a wish.
Okay, thank you. Before we do the questions, I'd like to thank our panel for their great insights and discussion. And now, before we go to lunch, we'll take a few minutes to do our live voting. As I mentioned, you can access this via your smartphone, tablet, or laptop, or whatever, by registering here. By signing on with the details here, email address, and the registration number, which is on your badge. A quick note for those of you watching from outside the room, in other parts of the world. If you just focus on me, then there's going to be a time delay for the questions because we need to filter it through. So please scroll down your screen. Below the social stream, you'll see the questions come up, and please answer those as they come up, and basically ignore me, as I'm sure most of the people in the room are doing anyway. But no, seriously, that really isn't for anyone here. That'll be pretty straightforward for everyone in the room, but everyone else has to look at the actual questions rather than listen to me. Okay, so we can pull up the first question whenever we're ready. So the first question comes from our global sponsor, Wallenius Wilhelmsen Logistics, and its GST is expected in 2016. What do you think will be its main benefit? Will it remove layers of taxation? Will it reduce congestion at state borders? Will it encourage distribution hubs? Will it reduce transport time from plant to dealer? Will it help better reach end customers? So you'll have some time to vote. And it's 64% removed layers of taxation. So pretty overwhelming. I'm assuming the others didn't come up because they weren't voted, although I'm right, yeah, so 0% on the transport time. I guess it doesn't obviously mean that isn't going to happen, but it's the main benefit. So clearly, as mentioned, making India, pan-India, a common market will be the key there with the taxation. So next question. Okay, what will be the biggest issue in automotive logistics in 2015? Will it be human resources? Will it be the Indian car market, so sales itself? Will it be the government's role in the market? Or will it be controlling your costs? Okay, the biggest issue is going to be the government, by 39%. That's interesting. Obviously, we haven't said biggest in terms of positive or negative. Perhaps it's the role that the government can play, as Nigel referred to in the budget that's coming up in February, and new regulations and things like GST. So everyone's kind of looking for the government to get things moving, or hopefully not hold things back. Okay, so appropriately then, what role can the government play to support automotive logistics? Can it support infrastructure investment? Should it be developing multimodal logistics? Should it be protecting the Indian automotive industry? Perhaps that's things like incentives and tax cuts. Should it just leave the industry to develop on its own, so minimal interaction interference? Or would the top thing be really the GST? Pretty tight race there between developing multimodal logistics at 43% and supporting infrastructure investment at 38%, and probably not mutually exclusive, I would probably add. So, you know, whatever that is, 70-odd% in and around infrastructure and multimodal logistics. 80% even. Okay, next question. All right, so some of your views on how the Indian market is going to develop in 2015. Do you expect good growth? Do you expect slight growth? Do you expect it to stay the same, or another contraction, or a shrink? You heard the figures projected, but what's your view from your company's perspective? Okay, that's pretty good, I suppose. 100% of you see growth, 40% would be very much welcome. Okay, next question. So, do you have concerns about human resource? And if you do, are those concerns about supply chain expertise, needing to improve supply chain education of your staff? Is it regular logistics shortages, whether that's drivers, warehousing, staff, equipment? Or is it the rising cost of logistics personnel? Okay, the top one by quite a way, supply chain expertise, need to improve supply chain education. So thankfully you're all here getting an expert education these next 2 days. I think we have one more question. So at what stage would you class India's logistics, let's say relative to other parts of the world? Would you say it's world class? Would you say it's good enough? Would you say it's almost there? Or does it have a long way to go? So vote now, please. Long way to go, it would seem. I guess we'll be seeing you here in India for many years to come at the Automotive District Conference. That's probably good news for Louis and I. Okay, that's the questions. Thanks to everyone in the room who participated. Thanks to our audience outside who also participated. And again, thanks to our panel who have left us for lunch ahead of all of you. Because yeah, they're probably hungry. Please join us for lunch. Just serve the buffet outside. From the afternoon, we're splitting up into 2 streams. So you'll see signs marked where each session is. Thanks again.